The not enough bricks parable. In understanding what causes financial booms and busts, or what's called the boom-bust cycle, but also what causes the bust part of the cycle, which is known as a recession or a depression, is this parable written by Ludwig von Mises, explaining how inflation and credit expansion impacts interest rates and therefore creates a boom-bust cycle. This can be done through a central bank or really just any artificial adding to the money and credit system without adding goods and services into that system as well, which is called inflation. Now, how this theory works, and it's fairly simple, is that interest rates, which is the price to borrow money, is affected normally by the fact that there is either more or less savings available in an economy in a given time. If there is a greater supply of saving in the economy, meaning people are putting off consumption in the present in order to enjoy savings in the future for whatever reason, if a lot of people do that at the same time, there's a greater pool of savings available, held usually in banks and similar financial institutions, from which to draw and borrow from and to get loans and things of this nature to grow businesses. And therefore, the interest rate comes down. Now, when people are consuming more and they're spending more, what ends up happening is that pool of savings shrinks and that price of the interest rate goes up because the supply has gone down and the demand has remained the same, meaning there's more people that want the same amount of money in order to borrow for loans and different financial ventures. Now, the interest rate has to be flexible. There is no correct or right interest rate in the sense that there's no right price. It changes according to supply and market demand. But what happens when you manipulate the interest rate artificially? Well, how can you manipulate the interest rate artificially? Well, if you have the power to add in money artificially to the economy, if you're able to increase the money supply, if you're able to pump money into the economy, which is inflation. Inflation is not rising prices. Inflation is the adding artificially to the money supply without adding goods or services. Now, what this does is it creates a situation in which there is new money and credit added into the economy, which makes it seem like there is a greater amount of goods and services. There's a greater amount of savings available, thereby bringing down the interest rate. Now, what does that bringing down the interest rate do? Well, that bringing down of the interest rate encourages businesses, companies, and individuals all at the same time to borrow and use more money in order to expand and to grow and to hire, when really there's not the same justification for that growth at that time. That growth will continue into seeming prosperity, seeming like there's a boom phase and a growth phase, but that growth is artificial. But it will outgrow the supply that is created from that assumption based on the inaccurate interest rate. The supply will outgrow the demand. And once that reality catches up, the boom can last a very long time. The boom before the Great Depression, in which the money supply was continually increased before the Great Depression, lasted from 1921 to 1929. So a boom can go up for a long time. However, it eventually has to correct. That can't just continue. That expansionary, inflationary, credit adding system can't go on forever, or else it would totally collapse the money system. You can't just keep inflating into nothing. So eventually interest rates have to go back up. Now the businesses have made these decisions in a cluster of error all at the same time. This causes a lot of them to have to readjust or go out of business, causing and spreading mass unemployment, usually through the economy. And the longer that the boom goes, the worse the bust cycle will be. So that's what causes the boom and bust. But it's really described well in this brick parable, the not enough bricks parable by Ludwig von Mises, that explains basically what happens with banks and companies and interest rates, why they responded to the interest rate and the way they did, and the consequences that it had. So he compares it to a builder, someone building a house. He says the whole entrepreneurial class is, as it were, in the position of a master builder. Position of a master builder whose task it is to erect a building out of a limited supply of building materials. If this man overestimates the quantity of the available supply, he draws a plan for the execution of which the means at his disposal are not sufficient. Corrections here because of the copying and pasting of this quote. Change some of the letters. He oversizes the groundwork and the foundations, and only discovers later in the progress of the construction that he lacks the material needed for the completion of the structure. It is obvious that our master builder's fault was not overinvestment, but an inappropriate employment of the means at his disposal. In other words, malinvestment. So imagine trying to build a house when you think you have more materials than you actually do. If you were told and misled by being told that you had enough materials, lumber, copper piping, wires, carpeting, tile, appliances like water heater and bathtubs and toilets and sinks and roof shingles and all this stuff. You have this pile of building materials for building a house. And you start building your house, but you are told you have enough materials to build a house that is 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. And so you draw up the plans and you start building. But you were misled. You were told that, but it wasn't true. What if there's only enough material there for 2 bedrooms, 1 bath? About half the size of what you expected. Now you start building under the assumptions of enough material, but it's not accurate. You only have half the material, the supply available of what you were told. And so the longer you build, it looks like you're doing something, it looks like everything's going well, but the longer you build without noticing the problem, the more painful the problem will be. It's not that you invested. You could have worked with what you had and you would have been willing to do so, but you have malinvested. You've used the materials in an inefficient way because you thought that you'd have enough to complete the job. Now you're going to have to either abandon the project or stop mid-project and be stuck and work it back to try to repurpose those materials. But you can't always do that. That's what happens to businesses and banks and other financial institutions when the money is added to the money supply, thereby bringing down the interest rate, making people think there's more savings, there's more supply than there is. Then they go and they malinvest. They continue to grow. It looks like there's prosperity as there is a temporary boom, but they get to this point where they realize, wait a second, there's not the demand for this. We don't have the supply for this. We don't have the materials to cover this. We've worked off of bad assumptions and our growth is artificial. And then there's a bust as a recession or a depression sets in and corrects back to reality. and the interest rate usually has to rise back to what it normally would have been under true market conditions, that it would not have otherwise been. And so the manipulation artificially of the interest rate through the manipulation artificially of the money supply can have these perverse consequences, perverse incentives that lead to consequences all throughout the economy, creating a cluster of error that comes to fruition all at the same time. And that's where you get a recession or depression, is because of what is creating the boom bust cycle in the first place.